Well, welcome this morning to all of you who are keeping up with our study of the book of Acts. We are going to go into the 17th chapter today. And before we get into it, just to make a comment about Luke and about the book of Acts. If you are like me, many times you read through these passages and you have enjoyed the narrative, but I didn't stop and look deeply at it and realize what a tremendous job Luke, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is doing. He not only gives us the events, the main events, but he analyzes them. And the example, we can see this morning. Before we have seen how Luke would give us the account of Paul's sermons or Peter's sermons, now we're going to see how he actually takes it apart and looks at the methodology that Paul uses. So we are getting the narrative, the message from many different aspects, many different angles. So with that in mind, let's begin. You'll notice that we're going to be examining today two more Macedonian cities, and those cities are Thessalonica and Berea. We've already looked at Philippi. So Paul is going to leave Philippi and go first to Thessalonica and then to Berea. Now let's go to the 17th chapter of the book of Acts and look at the first 9 verses. Then we're going to go back and look more deeply at them. In verse 1, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them. And they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Just a side comment, Luke says they passed through Amphipolis. He gives us interesting detail, also Apollonia. Nothing is said further about these two cities, but I just happen to remember that in Amphipolis, about 500 years before Paul's time, there were 2 great battles between the Athenians and the Spartans during the Great Peloponnesian War. And these battles were losses to the Athenians and substantial victories for the Spartans because Athens was under a demagogue who didn't know anything about commanding an army or leading a city. And this monument at Amphipolis, the Lion Monument, commemorates those victories of the Spartans. Now, to go back to our text, and let's just look at these first 3 verses, because there's considerable information here. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is where Luke actually gives us Paul's methodology in preaching. And it is it's different from just setting forth the sermon itself. So they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now remember that where there are synagogues, Paul always goes first to the synagogue. He does so because that is the covenant arrangement of God. Therefore, it would be wrong for him not to do so because the Jews were entitled to hear the gospel first. Also, it gives him an audience, a ready-made audience. It gives him an audience who are supposedly acquainted with the scriptures, believe in God, and besides being Jews there would be many of these proselytes of the gate, Gentiles, Greeks, who have come there knowing that there is a true God and pursuing that. So it's a wonderful opportunity for Paul. And we've talked before about the fact that if people are converted in the synagogue, then they are able to go out and bear witness to Christ. So Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. And you'll notice 3 verbs here: reasoned, explaining, participle form, and proving, participle. But they're 3 verbs. This is what Paul did. So let's take those verbs and look at them. Now, again, this is not the complete sermon. There is, however, a brief resume of what Paul was preaching, just enough so we'll know what Paul was talking about, the substance of his sermon. So he reasoned, explaining from the scriptures that they knew that were before them. And the word for reason there is the word dialogeto. We get our word dialogue from that. It's translated here as reason. It literally means to explain or discuss. Now, assuming that this is the order of the sermon, he would be presenting to the synagogue the reasons for their listening, what he's going to do, why it's important. I would think he would be talking about their need for being right with God and how the law did not accomplish that. Then, under reasoning from the scriptures, the next verb says explaining. So in the process of reasoning from the scriptures, he was explaining. Interesting word, dianogoin. Dianogoin is to open or reveal. Some of the translations actually say opening. This one says explaining. But in the sense of opening, it is the fact that they didn't know about who the Messiah was. And so he is opening up for them, revealing for them new truth that they did not yet understand. They had the Old Testament prophecies. What they didn't know was that this Jesus, whom Paul is proclaiming is the Messiah, the fulfillment of those prophecies, he's opening that to them. Now, what is particularly important in opening this up and explaining it is that to a Jew, the cross was a stumbling block. They could not conceive of the fact that the Messiah would die. They believed he was a great military hero who would conquer the Romans and enable Israel again to be free. That's not the true Messiah. The true Messiah had to die and pay for the sins of his people. So that's the opening up part of it that's so necessary. And then the next verb says, and proving. And this word comes from the word paratithemos, and it's and titheme, which means to set before or to commend. It's the idea of submitting it to the hearers. So let's go back and look at it. He's going to come to the synagogue and he's going to say, there are some things you need to know from the scriptures and need to know where the scriptures are pointing to in reference to your Messiah. Then he opens it up and declares to them about Christ. And now he sets it before them, commending it to them. Here it is. Here it is. You can now believe it. That is the methodology, the way, the procedure that Paul is using. And I would think that Luke intends for us to understand that this is his procedure everywhere where he's talking to the Jews. Now, some comments here at the bottom of your screen that I picked up from James Montgomery Boyce, because he was relating this to some of the ways that people preach today and some of the things that we hear in churches today. He said, this was not coercing. He didn't do that. He submitted it to the hearers. He didn't coerce them. Neither is it entertaining. Neither is it a matter of propagating some type of business, a ministry business, as we sometimes see today. And Boyce said, this again is the kerygma, the essence, the basic gospel of Christ. That's what he's dealing with there. So these are very important comments that Luke is providing. It's necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, right now, as I open this up, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. He is your Messiah. So we'll go on with the text now at verse 4. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason, some of the brothers, before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them. And they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason, they let them go. Now let's go back and look at this in a little more detail. First of all, as is the case everywhere Paul went, there were people who were persuaded. There were people who believed. And these people now joined with Paul and Silas. And then he says that there were devout Greeks also among Jews, some Jews and some devout Greeks. Now, what does he mean by devout Greeks? Please notice the footnote here, number 1 at the bottom of the screen. And this is from Calvin. He said the devout Greeks are those who had taken farewell to idols. Matthew Henry says the same thing. In other words, there were people, and we see this throughout our study of Acts. And that's why, indeed, the gospel came at just the right time, at the fullness of times, because it is a time when people throughout the Greco-Roman Empire had become disenchanted with their religion. They had taken farewell to idols. And so they were open to truth, to who the true God is. So we have these people believing, and he says not a few of the leading women. Now there are 3 times that Paul mentions women who believed, who were leading women. These are women of high standing, people who were women who were respected in the community. And they no doubt were Gentiles, Greeks, they no doubt were proselytes of the gate. We'll talk about that a little more later. And come to verse 5. The Jews were jealous, and they came after Paul and tried to arrest him. Of course, he's not there. They are going to get Jason. This is the pattern we have seen over and over and over again. You really saw it with Christ. Back when we studied the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees, the scribes, they followed Jesus around, trying to trap him, trying to get him to say something that they could accuse him of breaking the law. Same thing with Paul. They follow him around. And so these Jews are jealous. That's the word zelos in Greek. Calvin said we should say kakazelos, which means, as he put it, evilly jealous. They were wickedly jealous. And they wanted to create a mob. Now, we're aware of the problems with mobs in our time, and the mobs are the same anytime. And so they wanted to form a mob to go after Paul and Silas. So what did they do? They went to the marketplace and they got wicked men of the rabble. That literally means from the marketplace. If you look at number 2, footnote at the bottom, the word take men from the marketplace, agoraion. The word for marketplace, as we saw last week, is agora. That's the center of government. That's the center of religion. That's the center of commerce. It's just a place where people, we put in modern terms, hang out. People are there. So they went to the marketplace and they gathered up wicked people, men in that marketplace, formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason. Now, I assume that Paul and Silas had been staying with Jason. I would assume that Jason was a convert by this time to Christianity, and they seek to bring them out to the crowd. Verse 6, when they couldn't find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities. Now, the word for city authorities, please note number 3 at the bottom of the screen, is Politarchos. It comes from two words, polis and archos. That is the ruler of the city. It's translated correctly, the rulers of the city. The interesting thing about it, the reason I'm pausing to comment here, is that that word that you see at the bottom there, Politarchos, does not apparently appear anywhere else in Greco-Roman history or in monuments or inscriptions, at least that have been found, except in Thessalonica. And it was found there. And the reason I'm saying that is because before it was found, before this inscription was found, indicating that the rulers of the city of Thessalonica were called Politarchos, skeptics who were trying to find anything they could to discredit Luke and to prove that he was not telling the truth and he was not historically reliable, latched onto that and said, this is a reason. This word does not occur. We know it does not occur. He made it up. No, he didn't make it up. It was found in Thessalonica. So they went to the city authorities and they shouted, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Now, as we talk about this today and as we quote this verse, we see it as a good thing. They had upset the order of the old pagan system and replaced it with the truth, with the Christianity. Of course, they didn't mean it that way. Turning the world upside down reminds me of when I'm dealing with a picture, downloaded a picture from the internet onto the computer, and it comes down as upside down or sideways. There'll be a menu up above, and you can click the menu on image, and one of them will be rotate. It will say to rotate it. So they rotated the world, as you see. They rotated it as far as the mob was concerned, to where it was upside down. Actually, it was rotated to where it's right side up. Anyway, verse 7, and Jason has received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. Do you recognize here? This is exactly the charge that was made against our Lord. When the Pharisees realized that Pilate couldn't care less about a theological matter, they accused Jesus of being another king, claiming he was another king in place of Caesar. And that is actually what was written on his cross, in the superscription above the cross, that he was king of the Jews. They're doing the same thing here to Paul and Silas. They're saying there's another king. Now, at the point that they make this charge, Claudius, the emperor in Rome, had expelled the Jews from Rome. The reason he did that was he's a very fearful person. He was afraid of being overthrown. He was afraid of being attacked. So he was a very timorous person. And Claudius was very sensitive to the idea of anyone proposing to replace him. And thus the mob leaders see an opportunity here to identify Paul and Silas as guilty of treason, another king, Jesus. Well, it worked with Christ before Pilate. It does not work here. The people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. It did disturb them, of course it would, but they did not put them in prison, as happened at Philippi. When they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. In other words, they took a bond from Jason. And no doubt, some of the commentators said this would be a bond that would include being able to call Paul and Silas back for trial. I suspect that these politarchs realized the evidence was not there. And they had a sense of justice, and to be commended for that. They had a sense of justice. We cannot try them when we don't have evidence. So they let them go and took the bond. That is different, and that is to be commended, certainly. So we now go to an explanation of this church that's going to be established here. What we've seen so far is Jason, and there are others, and that forms the nucleus of this church in Thessalonica. Now, Luke doesn't give us considerable details about the church because he's going to go on and follow Paul to Berea. But this is an assessment later of the Thessalonian church. And I put this in because I think we can understand just what kind of a church it became with people like Jason and others in the leadership. We give thanks to God always for all of you, constantly mentioning you in our prayers, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. For we know, brothers, loved by God, that he has chosen you, because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit and with full conviction. You know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. And you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. Now, let's look at some of the main points that Paul makes here, and I'm including also in this chapter 2 and verse 13. 5 points. First, the preaching of Paul in Thessalonica, of course, Silas also, that preaching was blessed by God. Chapter 1, verse 5, because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit with full conviction. Secondly, the people received the word eagerly. Chapter 2, verse 13. And we also thank God constantly for this, that when you received the word of God, which you heard from us, you accepted it not as the word of men, but as what it really is, the word of God, which is at work in you believers. Third, the believers tried to model their Christian lives after Paul. Chapter 1, verse 6. And you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction, with the joy of the Holy Spirit. Fourth, they became models themselves. Chapter 1, verse 7, so that you became an example to all believers in Macedonia and Achaia. And fifth, the church at Thessalonica became a missionary church. Chapter 1, verse 8, for not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. Now, before we leave Thessalonica, there's a view of the Agora in Thessalonica. It is a place where archaeology is ongoing. I'll show you another picture later. This is one I took from the internet. I've got one I took myself. But you can see here the road going through the Agora. I do not know where the synagogue was, where the house of Jason was, where the politarchs held their court. That is unknown. It wasn't marked, but at least it gives you an idea. There's another picture, this is mine, showing you the archaeological work that's going on in the background there. And you can see how they've dug down. This is the very center of the city of Thessalonica. They've dug down deeper to find this level where at the time of Paul. Now, with that, we'll leave Thessalonica and follow the narrative at verse 10, chapter 17, verse 10. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them, therefore, believed, with not a few women of high standing, as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens. And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now, let's look at a few of the words I've underlined here. First of all, by the first words in chapter 17, verse 10, the brothers, and we know now, and we saw it before, Thessalonica has developed from just an audience listening to Paul preach in a synagogue. It's developed to the point now that we have brothers, therefore we have a church in Thessalonica. Where they were meeting, other than the house of Jason, they might have been meeting there, we do not know. So the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. That's why when they came to the house of Jason, they didn't find them. They had been sent away already. They wanted to safeguard Paul and Silas. So they've gone to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into a Jewish synagogue. There is a synagogue in Berea, as there was in Thessalonica, as there was not in Philippi. So this again gives them that advantage to be able to preach in the synagogue. And then there's a comparison, a contrast actually, that Luke makes between the Jews in Berea and the Jews in Thessalonica. He says, now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. I'm going to come to a little comparison chart in a moment, but for now, notice these Jews were more noble. Now, there are two ways that they could have been more noble than those in Thessalonica. They could have been of the nobility of the high class, ruling class, socially higher, or they could have been more noble in character. Now, I believe, and as do the commentators, they were more noble in character, not necessarily in social standing, than those in Thessalonica. And how were they more noble? They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So they checked out what Paul was saying. Many of them, verse 12, therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing. And here I've given you the word eskemonon, which means respected, presentable, or graceful. So those words describe these women, respected in the community, presentable. You can understand by that what presentable would mean in their relationship to people in society, and they were graceful. So these Greek women as well as men, and all of these people no doubt were proselytes of the gate. They were people who had had it with the idols, so to speak, and were pursuing knowledge of the true God. And then that same pattern that we've seen before, the Jews, these zealous Jews, these wickedly zealous Jews, follow Paul around, and they came all the way from Thessalonica. When the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul in Berea also, they came there too, doing the same thing, agitating, stirring up the crowds. That's their modus operandi. But, verse 14, the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea. But Silas and Timothy remained there. So the brothers, it's the second time we've seen the word here in this context, meaning the believers, meaning that nucleus of the new church in Thessalonica. They saw the problem, they saw what was going to happen, and they immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained in Berea. Remember that Luke had remained in Philippi, and Silas and Timothy now remaining in Berea, so Paul's company is getting smaller, and Paul, of course, is the key person. They need to protect him, and by Luke remaining in Philippi and Silas and Timothy remaining in Berea, they have the opportunity to continue to teach and to strengthen and to confirm, thus to sanctify the church there. They need that because they're babes in Christ. They're feeding on the milk of the word. And Silas, Timothy, Luke can provide the meat of the word. But there's something very interesting here. Let's notice that you might pass by this point. They sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but he didn't go by sea. Why did they send him off on his way to the sea, following the road that normally led to the sea, and then obviously turning off that road and going by land? Because Paul went by land to Athens. And the commentators suggest that it was to throw them off, to throw the Jews off. They thought he went to the seaport and took a ship, and that he didn't do, and they didn't find him there. So this is rather clever on the part of the brothers in Thessalonica, in Berea, excuse me. They thought very well about the problem and what would happen. And Silas and Timothy remained there, and those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens. In other words, they went with him all the way up to Athens. And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come as soon as possible, they departed, went back to Berea. And Paul said, I want you to tell Silas and Timothy to come to me as soon as possible. And so he's going to be in Athens by himself for a while. Here's a map that shows you where Berea is. This gives you an idea of the whole course of Paul's second missionary journey. You see on the right in the rather yellow area of Anatolia, you see where Troas is, and then you see where Neapolis is across the sea, and that's the port of Philippi. You see where Philippi is, and then come to the left to Thessalonica, and you see the distance from Thessalonica to Berea is not a huge distance, but you see Athens down at the bottom, and that's where we'll see Paul next in the next study in chapter 17. Now, I mentioned I'm going to show you a little bit of a chart of the comparisons and the contrasts between the Thessalonians and the Bereans. In both Thessalonica and Berea, in both cities, the gospel was preached in synagogues. Paul went first to the synagogue. In both these cities, there were synagogues. And in both cases, the gospel was believed by a substantial number of people. And those people included Jews and included proselytes of the gate, both men and women. And we have comment that the women were women of high standing. In both cities, Thessalonica and Berea, in both cities, sound, faithful churches were established. I read to you a moment ago the excerpt from Paul's letter to First Thessalonians, which it is thought that is his very first letter that he wrote. That's the beginning of it. And in that, he certainly praises them for their faithfulness. So, and we know of Berea's. So in both cities, sound, faithful churches were established. Here's the difference. In Berea, those who heard the gospel took the initiative to find out if these things spoken by Paul were true. And you can envision in Thessalonica, these people who listened to Paul and believed Paul were taking it in. Paul was speaking to them, they were believing it. That's good. But even better is this. In Berea, they took the initiative on their own to find out if what Paul was saying was really true. And Luke says, essentially, it's a careful, critical examination of the scriptures on a daily basis. Now, the scriptures that they had that they could examine would, of course, be our Old Testament. And so they went to these scriptures, I'm sure particularly the prophecies of the coming of Christ, and examined them very carefully, very critically. That is an expression of the nobility of character in these people. And it certainly is an example that all of us should follow. I don't think we could stress that too highly. Now, R.C.H. Lenski, whom I consulted, and Lenski is a Lutheran, but he pointed out something very interesting I hadn't thought about. What the Bereans did is a very good example of what Martin Luther called the priesthood of all believers. There were three main points. If you sum up Luther's teaching, there were three main points: a belief in salvation by grace through faith alone, and the priesthood of all believers, and the right and obligation to study the scriptures, for each person to study the scriptures on his own. And there's a connection in these three. There's an order to it. If you believe that you're saved by faith alone, you're justified by faith alone, and therefore you do not need the approval of priests, of human priests, of the church, but it's between you and God that you come to believe in Christ, then We can move to the fact that all Christians, all believers are really priests who are not dependent upon men. They can come before God now that they've been justified and are righteous in his sight. And that would open the way to the Word of God. You have the right then to approach the Word of God, which you could not do in the Roman Church. They controlled it. You have the right and the obligation to study the scriptures on your own. And here's the example right here in Berea in the time of Paul's preaching. And the scholars commented, and I totally agree, that the more we examine the scriptures, the more our faith grows, it increases and establishes us with greater certainty of the gospel. Nothing but good comes from this careful, critical examination of the scriptures on a daily basis. Well, thank you for joining us today. Next week, we will turn our attention to that famous sermon Paul preached in Athens.